Welcome to Smart Bites. In this show, we take a close look at interesting topics, using what we learn from trustworthy articles and research to give you the straight facts. Today, we're diving deep into marijuana and what it does to your brain and body. We'll explore the science behind its effects, both the good and, well, the not so good. So, how exactly does this plant mess with our incredibly complex systems?
That really is the big question, isn't it? Marijuana's definitely, entered the mainstream conversation, and our sources give us a solid scientific look at how it interacts with us, biologically speaking.
Right. Now, when we talk about marijuana, we always hear about THC and CBD. What are these things, and what do they actually do?
Okay, so think of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, as the main event, really. It's the chemical that makes you feel high. CBD, which is short for cannabidiol, it's different. In its pure form, it doesn't have that psychoactive effect. You often see it talked about with hemp, which is basically cannabis with very, very little THC.
Okay, so THC gets you high, CBD doesn't. Simple enough. But how do they actually work inside us? I keep hearing about this cannabinoid system. What's that all about?
That's really the key player here. Your body has this built-in network. It's called the endocannabinoid system. It's got receptors, like tiny docking stations, spread all through your brain and body. And what's really wild is that your body makes its own natural chemicals. They're called endocannabinoids that fit into these same docking stations. They often work in a kind of backwards signaling between brain cells. It's like a way for them to fine-tune their communication.
Backwards signaling. Huh. Sounds complicated. So what happens when THC shows up?
Well, THC is like a key that fits into those same cannabinoid receptors, but it hits like all of them all over your brain at once. Imagine your brain has locks everywhere, right? And THC has keys that fit all of them, just turning them on or off without much discrimination. This widespread binding, it messes with the levels of important brain chemicals, things like dopamine and norepinephrine.
Okay. Those are involved in mood and alertness.
Exactly. Pleasure, mood, how alert you feel, all that stuff gets affected.
Then CBD, does it just sort of hang out in the background then?
Not really, no. CBD can actually dial down some of the less pleasant effects of THC, like anxiety, for example. That's why the balance of THC to CBD in different types or strains of cannabis can lead to really different experiences for people.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and remember, CBD itself doesn't produce that high like THC. It seems to interact with the system in a way that can buffer some of THC's more negative sides.
Right, okay. Now, how fast do you actually feel the effects? Does it matter if you smoke it or eat it?
Oh, big difference there. If you smoke or vape marijuana, the effects can hit you within like 30 seconds. They usually peak within maybe half an hour to an hour. Edibles, though, totally different. They take much longer to kick in because they have to go through your stomach and liver first before getting into your bloodstream.
Good to know. So patience is definitely key with edibles, especially if you're trying it for the first time. Now, our sources mentioned THC and CBD are lipophilic. What does that mean for how they affect us?
Lipophilic, yeah. It basically just means they're fat soluble. They dissolve in fats or lipids. And since your cell membranes, including the ones around your brain cells, your neurons, are made of these fatty layers.
So they can slip right through.
Exactly. THC and CBD can easily slip through those membranes and get inside the cells. Because they dissolve in fat, they can cross those brain cell membranes really fast, leading to quick and widespread effects. Much faster than things that are water-soluble. This easy access is a big reason why they have such a noticeable impact,
Okay, so they sneak right into our brain cells and start tweaking our brain chemicals. Let's talk about the mental effects. What kind of things might someone feel?
Well, the mental effects are really subjective. They vary a lot depending on the person, how they used it, even where they are when they use it. People often describe feeling high or stoned. That can include things like an altered sense of awareness, feeling really happy or euphoric, relaxed, less stressed. Some people also say they enjoy things like art, jokes, music more intensely. They might feel more sociable or maybe more introspective.
That sounds like the fun stuff people talk about. But I know there can be a flip side, right?
Absolutely. On the less fun side, marijuana can definitely mess with your memory. It can make you feel paranoid and it can trigger anxiety. In fact, feeling anxious is one of the most common negative effects reported. Some research suggests that up to maybe 30% of people who use marijuana recreationally might experience intense anxiety or even a panic attack at some point.
30%? Wow.
Yeah, and if you haven't used it much before or you're in a place you don't know well, that risk seems to go up.
I've also heard people talk about different kinds of marijuana, like sativa and indica, having different effects. Is there any real science behind that distinction?
Well, there are some general trends people report, but it's probably not as clear-cut as, the marketing might suggest. Sativa types are often linked to feeling more focused, maybe having a better mood, feeling more energetic. But for some people, they can also increase anxiety or paranoia.
Okay.
Interestingly, they seem to activate the front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in thinking and focus.
An indica.
Right.
What's the deal with that? Typically.
Indica types are more often associated with feeling relaxed, maybe sleepy. Some scientists think this might be because they can kind of quiet down activity in that prefrontal cortex, basically turning off some of the overthinking and planning. But just like with sativa, these aren't hard and fast rules. There's a lot of individual variation.
So it's not quite as simple as just picking one for energy and the other for sleep.
Not really, no. And our sources also point out that people can have these kind of weird changes in perception too, like time feeling stretched out or distances seeming off. Sounds, colors, smells might feel way more intense. And crucially, your judgment can also be impaired.
Right, that impaired judgment is key. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the physical effects. What happens to your body? Let's start with the heart.
Yeah, pretty quickly after using marijuana, especially if you inhale it, smoke it, or vape it, you can see your heart rate jump, sometimes by 20, even up to 100% within minutes.
Wow, that's significant.
It is, and it usually lasts for a couple of hours. It happens mainly because your blood vessels widen, which makes the heart work harder. There can also be ups and downs in your blood pressure.
Is it generally something to be seriously concerned about?
Well, for young, healthy folks, it's usually not a major issue, but it can definitely be riskier for older people or anyone with existing heart problems. That faster heart rate and the changes in blood pressure put more strain on the heart. And in people who are already vulnerable, there's a potential risk of more serious events, like even a heart attack or stroke.
That's a really important warning. Okay, what about the lungs? We all know smoking anything isn't great for you.
You're absolutely right. Smoking marijuana can lead to things like bronchitis, more phlegm, irritated lungs, sort of similar to what you see with tobacco smoke. Marijuana smoke actually has some of the same cancer-causing chemicals, carcinogens, and in some cases, maybe even higher levels of certain nasty stuff like ammonia or hydrogen cyanide.
But interestingly, our sources mention that as of now, like 2025, there isn't super strong evidence directly linking smoking marijuana itself to lung cancer. Why might that be?
Yeah, the reasons aren't totally clear yet. Some researchers think it might be because people who smoke marijuana tend to do it, well, less often than typical cigarette smokers. Or maybe they don't inhale as much total smoke volume over time. There's also a theory, though it needs more research, that some of the anti-inflammatory compounds in marijuana, like CBD, might counteract some of the harmful effects of the smoke. But that's still speculative.
Still, even if it's not clearly linked to lung cancer yet, there are definitely still lung risks.
Right, absolutely. It can certainly make existing lung conditions like asthma worse. And it can weaken the immune defenses in your lungs. This might make you more likely to get infections, including nasty fungal infections like aspergillus, if the cannabis itself is contaminated with mold.
Yikes.
Yeah. And vaping and dabbing, these newer methods, they also come with their own lung-related dangers that we're still learning about. One of our sources even pointed out something quite striking. People who only smoke marijuana can actually show more inflammation in their major airways than people who only smoke tobacco cigarettes.
Wow, really? That definitely challenges the idea that it's somehow a safer way to smoke.
It really does. It's eye-opening.
Okay, let's talk about something a bit more famous. The munchies. What's going on in our bodies that makes us want to eat everything in sight?
Ah, yes. The munchies. That increased appetite after using cannabis is pretty well known, right? It seems to involve a couple of things happening in your brain. THC might mess with the signals that usually tell you you're full. It might even make certain neurons that normally decrease hunger act in an uncharacteristic way. There's also evidence that THC and CBD can affect your blood sugar levels and the communication between your brain and your gut, all of which can contribute to feeling hungrier and making food seem more appealing.
It's fascinating, actually. Our own natural endocannabinoids are even found in breast milk and are linked to baby suckling behavior. So it taps into something quite fundamental.
So it's tapping into some really basic biological urges then. Interesting. What about how it affects our ability to move and coordinate? I know driving under the influence is a huge issue. It absolutely is. Marijuana definitely messes with your driving skills, no question. It can slow down your reaction times, make it harder to stay in your lane, reduce your coordination, and make it tougher to respond to unexpected signals or events on the road. Studies have consistently shown that your risk of being in a car accident almost doubles soon after using marijuana.
Doubles. Oh, yeah.
And if you test positive for THC, especially at higher levels, you're significantly more likely, maybe 3 to 7 times more likely, to be found responsible for an accident compared to someone who hasn't used drugs or alcohol.
How does that compare to, say, drinking and driving?
Well, the increased risk with marijuana is serious, but it's generally still considered lower than driving with a blood alcohol level over the legal limit, which might increase risk even more, say 5 times or higher, depending on the BAC. However, and this is crucial, if you combine marijuana and alcohol, that risk shoots up much, much higher than using either one alone.
Okay, that's a dangerous mix.
Definitely. Also, your driving abilities might not fully recover for 5 or 6 hours after using marijuana.
Oh, yeah.
And even if you use it regularly and think you've built up some tolerance, objective tests can still show you're impaired.
That's crucial information.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to know that. Okay, let's move on to the stomach and digestive system. We talked about appetite, but are there other effects there?
Yes. Cannabinoids can actually help reduce nausea and vomiting, which is one reason it's used medicinally sometimes, like for cancer patients undergoing chemo. However, there's a strange flip side. If you use high doses for a long time, chronically, it can lead to this condition called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS.
CHS? What's that?
It involves these recurring episodes of really severe nausea, vomiting, and stomach pain. And oddly enough, people often find that taking hot showers or baths brings temporary relief. The only real fix seems to be stopping cannabis use completely.
That sounds absolutely awful. Why does it happen?
Scientists aren't totally sure yet. It probably involves some kind of disruption or dysregulation of the body's own endocannabinoid system from the constant high exposure. There are also some potential links suggested between chronic use and other GI issues like acid reflux or maybe even pancreatitis or ulcers, but the evidence there is still developing.
Okay, that CHS is definitely something people should be aware of if they're heavy long-term users. What about the long-term effects on the brain itself? Are there lasting neurological consequences we need to talk about?
Yes, this is a really serious area of concern, especially with long-term heavy use, and particularly when use starts in adolescence. Research strongly suggests that using marijuana regularly over a long period can impair cognitive functions, things like memory, attention, and executive functions, which are your ability to plan, organize, and make decisions.
Impaired how? Temporarily or permanently?
Well, studies that follow people over time, longitudinal studies, especially those who started using heavily as teenagers, have shown potential negative effects on the brain's resting state connectivity, how different brain areas communicate. And some studies have controversially suggested a possible drop in IQ points that might not be fully recoverable, particularly with adolescent onset heavy use.
Wow. IQ loss.
It's a debated finding, but a concerning one. There's also evidence of actual structural changes in the brains of some long-term users. Things like a smaller hippocampus, which is crucial for memory formation, and changes in other areas like the amygdala, cerebellum, and frontal cortex. Heavy users might also show less brain activation when they're doing working memory tasks compared to non-users. It suggests potential long-term changes, maybe even damage.
That's really sobering to hear, especially the potential impact on young people. What about our immune system? Does marijuana affect its ability to fight off infections?
There is evidence that THC can have immunosuppressive effects. Basically, it can weaken the immune system somewhat. This could potentially make you more susceptible to getting sick. We already mentioned the risk of lung infections like aspergillus from contaminated cannabis, but it might have broader effects on your body's ability to fight off other germs too.
Okay. And before we move fully into mental health, what about reproductive health? Any effects there?
Yes, there's evidence suggesting marijuana use can affect sperm production and function in males. And in females, it might affect ovulation, hormonal balance, and potentially impact pregnancy outcomes, which we should definitely talk more about.
Right. And any other general physical effects? I think I saw something about tumor growth.
That's a really complex area. There's some lab research, preclinical studies suggesting certain cannabinoids might actually have anti-cancer properties or interfere with tumor growth. But, and this is a huge but, the smoke itself contains carcinogens, as we discussed. So the overall effect in humans is far from clear and likely very complicated. It's definitely not a proven cancer treatment.
Okay, that's a pretty complete picture of the physical side. Now let's get into the often debated topic of mental health. What does the science tell us about the link between marijuana and mental health issues?
This is a really important but also very complex area. Let's start with serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia. There's quite a strong association shown in research between marijuana use, especially starting young, using frequently, using heavily, and an increased risk of developing schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders.
Particularly if you have a genetic risk.
Exactly, particularly if you already have a genetic vulnerability like a family history or maybe specific genes like AKT1 or COMT that have been implicated. The heaviest users might face something like a 3.9 times increased risk compared to non-users. And for people who already have these disorders, cannabis use can often worsen symptoms and trigger relapses.
Does it affect all symptoms equally?
That's where it gets nuanced. The data is a bit mixed on effects on positive symptoms like hallucinations or delusions. But generally, research suggests it doesn't worsen negative symptoms like lack of motivation or flat affect. And some studies, maybe counterintuitively, have even suggested slightly better cognitive performance in people with psychotic disorders who use cannabis compared to those with the disorders who don't use.
It's complex.
Really complex indeed. What about bipolar disorder?
The evidence for a direct link between using cannabis and actually developing bipolar disorder seems less strong, although some studies do suggest a possible connection, particularly with regular or daily use. However, there's stronger evidence that using cannabis can worsen the course of bipolar disorder for those who already have it.
How so?
It seems to increase the likelihood, the severity, and maybe the duration of manic phases.
Okay. And what about depression and anxiety? Those are incredibly common. Does cannabis help or hurt? Well, studies that follow people over time, again, have shown a small increased risk of developing depressive disorders or symptoms associated with cannabis use. There seems to be a dose-response relationship, meaning the risk tends to be higher with heavier use.
But does that hold up when you account for other factors?
That's a good point. The association often weakens quite a bit when researchers adjust for confounding factors, like using other drugs or having pre-existing conditions before starting cannabis use. When it comes to anxiety, the picture is also mixed, but leans towards risk. Using cannabis regularly is associated with having more anxiety symptoms and a higher risk of developing anxiety disorders, especially during withdrawal from heavy use.
What about specific anxiety disorders?
The findings on social anxiety and recovering from panic disorder are less consistent, kind of all over the place. But it is worth noting that the risk of being diagnosed with any anxiety disorder appears to be significantly higher, maybe 2 to 4 times higher, in people who misuse cannabis or meet criteria for cannabis use disorder.
And suicide risk.
Unfortunately, yes. Heavier and more frequent cannabis use, particularly starting in adolescence or young adulthood, has been linked in studies to increased suicidal thoughts and attempts.
So it really sounds like while some people might use cannabis hoping it will help with their mental health, the overall scientific picture suggests it could actually increase the risk for many or make existing conditions worse.
That's a very fair summary of the general trend in the research, yes. And this naturally leads us to the idea of cannabis use disorder, or CUD. What exactly is that?
Right. CUD isn't just using cannabis, it's when that use starts causing clinically significant impairment or distress in your life. This can manifest in several ways. Not being able to control your use, continuing to use it even when you know it's causing problems physically, socially, at work, or school. Developing tolerance so you need more to get the same effect. Experiencing withdrawal symptoms when you try to cut down or stop. And having strong cravings for it.
How common is it?
Well, estimates suggest that a pretty significant chunk of people who ever used cannabis, maybe around 22%, meet the criteria at some point. And for those who use weekly or daily, that number jumps higher, maybe up to a third.
What makes someone more likely to develop CUD?
Some key risk factors identified are being male, being younger when you start using, and importantly, using high-potency cannabis products. Higher THC seems linked to a faster onset of dependence.
And this is now formally recognized as a potential issue.
Yes, the official diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, now includes craving and withdrawal as criteria. It clearly recognizes that you can become dependent on cannabis, both physiologically and psychologically. It even specifies severity levels, mild, moderate, or severe, depending on how many of those criteria someone meets.
And does CUD usually show up by itself, or is it often linked with other problems?
It very often co-occurs, unfortunately. It's frequently seen alongside other substance use disorders, as well as a whole range of mental health conditions. Mood disorders like depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, personality disorders.
And the more severe the CUD, generally the more likely these other issues are present, and the greater the overall disability or difficulty the person experiences in their life.
Is treatment common for it?
That's a major issue. There seems to be a significant gap between how many people likely have CUD and how many actually seek or receive treatment for it.
That's definitely a concerning gap in care. Let's focus now specifically on a group that we've touched on as being particularly vulnerable, teenagers. How does marijuana really affect their developing brains?
Yeah, the teenage brain is definitely more sensitive to the negative effects of marijuana. It's still undergoing really crucial development, pruning connections, strengthening others, myelination.
So introducing THC during that period is risky.
Extremely risky. The potential harms are significant. We're talking about impaired brain development, problems with cognitive functions like memory, learning, attention, and as we mentioned, potentially even leading to that lasting loss of IQ points, although the extent is still debated. Teenagers who use marijuana also face a higher risk of developing mental health issues down the line, depression, anxiety, and especially psychosis or schizophrenia, particularly if they start young and use heavily.
An addiction risk.
Yes. They're also more likely to develop cannabis use disorder. The developing brain seems more susceptible to addiction pathways being established, and all of this can have a negative impact on their academic performance, lower grades, higher dropout rates, and their social lives too.
When is the risk greatest?
Starting use early in adolescence, especially before age 15, seems to be consistently associated with more severe and longer-lasting negative outcomes compared to starting later.
So it really sounds like delaying or ideally avoiding marijuana use entirely during the teen years is incredibly important for long-term brain health and well-being.
That's definitely the message from the research, yes.
Okay, what about another critical period? Pregnancy.
The risks associated with using marijuana during pregnancy are also very serious and shouldn't be understated. Research links it to potential fetal growth restriction, the baby not growing as much as expected in the womb. There's an increased risk of stillbirth reported in some studies, higher chances of preterm birth, and low birth weight.
And effects after the baby's born.
Yes, there are serious concerns about long-term problems with the baby's brain development. This could affect things like memory, learning ability, attention span, and behavior as the child grows. Some studies also suggest altered sleep patterns in infants exposed in utero and potentially an increased risk of that child using substances themselves later in life.
Does the increasing potency matter here too?
Absolutely. The fact that marijuana products are so much stronger now with higher THC levels makes using it during pregnancy potentially even riskier than it might have been decades ago.
And breastfeeding.
Yes, THC and other cannabinoids can be transmitted to the baby through breast milk. So the strong recommendation from virtually all health authorities is to avoid all marijuana use if you are pregnant, trying to become pregnant, or breastfeeding.
Given all these potential harms we've discussed for teens, during pregnancy, mental health links, cognitive effects, it's quite worrying to hear about the trend you mentioned. THC potency going way up, while perceived risk, especially among young people, seems to be going down.
You've hit on a really critical public health paradox right there. It's deeply concerning. THC levels have, on average, tripled or even more in some products compared to a few decades ago. At the same time, particularly among adolescents and young adults, fewer people seem to view marijuana use as risky or harmful.
Why is that specific combination so dangerous?
Because higher THC levels are directly linked to more pronounced psychoactive effects, which sounds obvious, but it also means a greater likelihood of negative experiences. We see links to more emergency room visits related to cannabis use, a greater potential for developing dependence or CUD, and a significantly higher risk of acute adverse psychological effects like severe anxiety, paranoia, and even triggering temporary psychosis in vulnerable individuals.
So the high-potency stuff available now really isn't the same as the marijuana people might remember from, say, the 70s or 80s.
Not at all. It has a fundamentally different risk profile. We need to understand that the potential consequences of using today's high THC products, whether it's flower, concentrates, or edibles, are likely greater than they were with the lower potency cannabis of the past.
This really underscores why it's so important to have accurate, science-based information out there and to maybe bust some of the common myths surrounding marijuana. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings we should clear up?
Well, one of the biggest, perhaps, is the lingering idea that marijuana is completely harmless or benign. As we've spent this whole time discussing, that's clearly not the case. It can be addictive for a significant number of users. It does impair your ability to drive safely. It can have negative effects on your cognitive function, especially with long-term or adolescent use. And it carries various physical and mental health risks, particularly these high-potency products.
What about the gateway drug idea?
That's another common one, the idea that using marijuana inevitably leads to using harder drugs. While it's true that many people who use other illicit substances also use or previously used marijuana, the vast majority of people who use marijuana do not go on to use harder drugs. The reasons why some individuals progress to other substance use are really complex, involving genetic factors, environmental influences, mental health status. It's not a simple automatic progression caused by marijuana itself. Calling it just a gateway drug oversimplifies a very complex issue.
Okay, good points to clarify. This has been a really deep dive into the science behind marijuana's effects. To quickly wrap things up, what are the main things you think our listeners should take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, the key takeaway is that marijuana has a really wide and complex range of effects on both your brain and your body. We've talked about the immediate mental and physical changes, the highs, the heart rate changes, the munchies, the impaired coordination, but also the potential long-term consequences, which seem particularly concerning for adolescents whose brains are still developing, and for anyone who is pregnant or breastfeeding. And critically, this increasing potency of cannabis products available today adds a whole new layer of complexity and potential risk that we didn't see to the same extent decades ago.
So understanding the science is key.
Absolutely. It's crucial to look at the scientific evidence, not just anecdotes or outdated beliefs, to make informed decisions about marijuana use, and to realize that the risks associated with today's super potent products might be quite different than many people assume based on past experiences or perceptions.
Thank you for giving us such a comprehensive and clear explanation of this really important and often confusing topic. This has been Smart Bites.